In the period we will examine, we are past the French Revolution, but not well past it. The Terror is over, but not the turmoil. We will span a period roughly between 1870 and 1890, a time that takes us from the decline of the Salon to the rise of the gallery as an art market, from the early Impressionists to the rise of the Post-Impressionists, and through the changing directions in art by the artists who were active during this time. In France, there were 6 governmental regime changes in less than 40 years. Lurching between restorations, empires, and republics, each phase brought with it chaos, murders, imprisonments, and deportations. Whatever triumphs we find in the art of this period should be seen against a backdrop of trauma. While French politics and life vacillated between tranquility and turmoil, art likewise moved from revolution to evolution. Just as there were radical changes in the government, there were also monumental changes in the art market, styles of art, and even in the artists themselves. The late 1880s saw more unrest in Europe. Coupled with the birth of photography and access to work by American photojournalists such as Matthew Brady, photojournalism became a favored method to document the wars and unrest across the continent, namely in France. In an effort to restore order and national pride, European governments turned to art and commissioned many monuments for this specific purpose. Auguste Rodin's The Defense is an example of such artwork, a sculpture which deliberately borrows from earlier patriotic works of art. Another monument from this period is the Statue of Liberty. Created in 1884 by artist Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, a gift from the French, the statue celebrated the century-long friendship between France and the United States. At the time, the Third Republic praised murals as the art form of choice, resulting in numerous large commissions. Toward the end of the 19th century, art battled to find its place in society, namely due to the questioning by the state regarding the role of the salon in the arts. The argument centered on whether or not the academy and the salon should be a host of the arts for the wider public, or rather a showplace for the nation's finest artwork. While the salon began to lose its authority by the close of the century, several popular genres were nonetheless born out of it, most notably naturalism and realism. Despite its waning influence, many artists still relied on the salon to gain respect. Buyers would rarely purchase pieces from artists who had not been exhibited at the salon. As a result, many salon alternatives originated during this time. Art galleries and dedicated art dealers catered to the groups of artists who preferred to exhibit outside the bureaucratic salon. Edouard Manet continued to be an artist whose works were received critically, particularly for their lack of beauty, sentiment, and narrative. With the organization of private galleries, artists who wished to revolt against the standards upheld in the salon, and follow in the tradition of Manet, finally had a venue in which to do so. As the recovery from the Franco-Prussian War and the French Commune moved forward, artists likewise moved beyond the idealized notions of Romanticism. There was also a transition away from the type of realism that involved covert or overt political themes. This led art in 2 directions. The first was naturalism, a careful detailing of urban or rural life. Naturalism tended to be either socially conscious, such as Jean-François Raphael's 1881 work, The Absinthe Drinkers, or life-affirming, such as with Jules Breton's 1884 painting, Song of the Lark. Breton's work perhaps helps us see the world as dawning on a new day, a fresh start in life after the war, whereas Raphael's work reminds us that not everyone rises to such a hopeful dawn. Apart from naturalism, the other direction that realism took was towards topics such as the leisure pursuits of the bourgeois, a style known as Impressionism. While some post-commune art reflected hope for the future, at times it also called attention to the horrors that had not yet been solved, or may have even worsened. Gustave Caillebau's 1877 Paris Street Rainy Day shows one side of this debate. Gone are the bodies, the burned buildings, and the rubble. Instead, we see a clean, almost razor-sharp geometric cityscape with strollers moving along, enjoying the sights. More than anything, Impressionism birthed a freedom in the arts. By breaking the rules, Impressionism freed artists from the stifling academic influence. Trained at the Académie Julienne, one of the private schools that admitted female students, and consequently married to Manet's brother, Berthe Morisot was one of the few well-exhibited women artists of the Impressionist movement, focusing her work primarily on the private lives of bourgeois women. In Gustave Caillebots' The Floor Scrapers, we see the artist depicting an honest scene of working-class men cast as the heroes of modern life. Modernizing the nude, we see the precision in Caillebots' execution of the piece. The men are depicted as actively employed, improving an upper-class studio, with the horrors of war hopefully behind them. Mary Cassatt was another well-known female Impressionist artist who too focused on the modern lives of women. Both Morisot and Cassatt also shared a preference for scenes depicting childhood, a subject matter contradictory to the typical content represented at the time. However, regardless of muse, much of Cassatt's Impressionist work leans towards the recurrent modernist theme of momentariness and impermanence. Another artist practicing the new Impressionist style was Edgar Degas. Degas shared with the other Impressionists a passion for capturing brief moments in time. However, rather than focusing on the effects of light or on repeating images, Degas was more interested in exploring the effects of viewing angles, field of view, and movement. This is evident in his 1874 work Rehearsal on Stage. The artist has chosen a somewhat elevated viewpoint, not floor or eye level. The cropping of the composition and the implied movement of the dancers stretching, tying shoes, and practicing gives the viewer an impression of witnessing a fleeting moment. The Impressionist exhibition of 1886 was the Impressionists' last group show and featured over 246 works, including pieces by Cassatt, Degas, Pissarro, and Morisot. Many artists began to show their work in private galleries instead of the salon exhibitions with the help of art dealers. This period ushered in the dealer-critic system, coined such by Harrison and Cynthia White, because art dealers would often bribe and persuade critics to write positive reviews of artworks and then go on to sell the reviewed pieces at inflated prices. Many young artists at this time felt demoralized by the ever-increasing greed and competition. As a response, Georges Seurat developed a new paint application technique called chromoluminarism, now referred to as pointillism. This technique involved building up the canvas using small uniform dots of different colors placed on a base color. It should be noted that Eugene Delacroix had explored a similar technique 50 years earlier. Art critic Félix Fénelon labeled Seurat a neo-impressionist because his method of paint application utilized a scientific system to break up the image surface, thus evolving the choppy brushwork characteristic in other Impressionist artwork. Seurat's Le Chouette signifies his implementation of Charles Henry's systematic theory that stated certain lines and colors, such as the upward sweeping legs of the dancers in the painting and its warm color palette, expands human consciousness by giving the viewer an experience of pleasure. Paul Signac was an anarchist who believed that social injustice was caused by government rule. In his In Times of Harmony, the artist indicates his beliefs and desires to achieve a harmonious world in which men, women, and children, of different social classes and backgrounds, could live harmoniously in a natural world unspoiled by expanding industry. Claude Monet's approach to painting changed drastically during the 1880s, from personal objectivity to subjectivity, calling more attention to his personal vision of reality. This can be seen in the series of haystacks he painted, in which the artist did not change the viewpoint or angle of vision, but instead highlighted the changes that light and atmosphere had on the same form over time. This radical redirection, choosing to focus on form and substance rather than on content and meaning, had a profound influence on non-objective painting in the 20th century. Degas' work also shifted during the late 1880s and 90s, characterized by the artist's presentation of subject matter reflecting the theatrical, in which the figures act a certain way because they know they are being watched, and the absorbative, in which the figures are absorbed in their own private thoughts and actions, completely unaware that they are being watched. Degas' Little Dancer depicts a young ballerina sculpted out of wax and exhibited with a gauze tutu and wig of real human hair tied with a ribbon. Although met with heavy criticism for its ugliness and realistic nature, Degas received much praise for his exact depiction of degeneration, a much feared biological theory introduced by Charles Darwin, marked by a return to a lower condition in the evolutionary process. Degeneration was believed to be represented in physical characteristics and behaviors of the lower social classes, classes from which dancers and actresses typically originated from. In the late 1880s, Pierre-Auguste Renoir told the dealer Ambroise Vollard that he had reached the end of Impressionism and could neither paint nor draw. During this time of conflict, Renoir went back to his academic roots and began to study the works of Ingres, who he deemed the greatest academic artist of the 19th century. Renoir's work changed drastically as he went through an Ingres period. Literary critic Harold Bloom called this anxiety of influence, referring to the feeling of awe an artist may get in the presence of the work of an older, much admired artist. As seen here, Renoir's bathers attempted to create a more updated and modern version of Ingres' large odalisque, with the addition of details such as a spine, joints, dimples, and skin folds. This is a very different comparison to the hyper-elongated torso depicted in Ingres' large odalisque. Renoir rejected the false perfection or idealism that didn't subject nature to the rules of symmetry and geometric proportions. Another comparison is seen here between Manet's Olympia and Paul Cézanne's painting A Modern Olympia. As part of the Impressionist generation, Cézanne's work had been characterized by religious imagery and sexual subject matter depicted in broadly brushed, dark colors throughout the 1860s and 70s. Compared to Renoir's effort to create a serious work of art, Cézanne's comes across as childlike, almost like a caricature. There is ambiguity in the painting, as the viewer can only guess where this scene is taking place. Perhaps in a bordello where a prostitute is being presented to a potential client, or perhaps in a gallery where an artwork is shown to a potential buyer. Could this be a look inside an erotic dream induced by alcohol or hashish? All speculation aside, A Modern Olympia is Cézanne's attempt to establish himself as a modernist, breaking away from traditional rules and past generations of art. Cézanne's brushwork, along with his use of color, allowed the artist to express volume and mass in his paintings. He utilized a renewal of traditional perspective. As seen in Bay of L'Aesthetique, the viewer's eye wanders across the picture, taking in multiple viewpoints. While his critics and contemporaries found his art distorted, others described this new development as adding a fourth dimension to his work. Perhaps one of the most affiliated artists and contributors to the Impressionism and Post-Impressionism movements is Vincent van Gogh. His troubled past and professional struggle to establish himself as an artist is thoroughly documented in nearly 700 letters written to his brother Theo. Van Gogh knew his art was original and outside current modern trends, especially from what he saw in other parts of Europe, specifically in Paris. In 1881, Van Gogh moved back into the family home with his brother. After falling in love with his cousin and facing a painful rejection, Van Gogh suffered a severe loss of faith and moved to the Dutch capital of Verhaeghe, where he briefly lived with a prostitute. In 1883, Van Gogh met and began working with Anton Mauve. Greatly inspired by Mauve's technique, Van Gogh began working with oils, eventually becoming his preferred medium. In 1885, Van Gogh's father passed away. Art was everything to him at this point in his life, and in his work The Potato Eaters, the artist portrays a dark tone that goes beyond the formal elements of art. He has painted a message that conveys the dire needs of a struggling society. In a letter to his brother, the artist describes the context of his work. I have tried to emphasize that those people, eating their potatoes in the lamplight, have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, and so it speaks of manual labor and how they have honestly earned their food. Starry Night is another dark work by Van Gogh, but also one of his most widely recognized today. Van Gogh was heavily influenced by Peter Paul Rubens, fascinated by his bold color choices. He was also captivated by Eugene Delacroix's color theory and remarkable application of paint, his lack of solid color, and the physicality of the paint, with strips and streaks of pigment showing his application. But most influential to Van Gogh was his discovery of Japanese art, with its attention to detail and formal compositional elements. A culmination of these influences can be seen in Starry Night. Completed during one of his rare lucid moments between intermittent seizures, Starry Night is a modified view from the artist's window. Life, death, and infinity are thematic in the interpretation of the town below, surrounded by small hills. Motion is omnipresent, represented in the movement of the cypress trees and mountains, and especially in the swirling of the stars through the sky. Many interpret Starry Night as a meditation on death, not as an ending, but as a reabsorption of the individual into the universe. In 1886, Van Gogh moved to Paris, believing it to be the center of artistic life. While in Paris, Van Gogh studied with Fernand Cormon, although he did not stay long as he was not creatively stimulated. Inspired by Impressionism, it began to affect the artist's work. The artist began using more color and lighter tones, experimenting with looser brushstrokes and landscapes as his subject matter. Influenced by Paul Signet and Georges Seurat, Van Gogh incorporated elements of pointillism into his work, although he never fully committed to the style. In 1888, still not satisfied with his skill level, Van Gogh moved to Aires, a province in France, and rented a yellow house in which he endeavored to create an artistic community. While in Aires, the artist produced an immense amount of work, sometimes painting for up to 16 hours a day. He also developed his own artistic philosophy and color theory, which he linked to music and harmony. He became fascinated with light, particularly how it is represented by the color yellow. He then began painting emotion, exploring the idea of changing shape and color to express feelings. Paul Gauguin eventually moved in with Van Gogh after financial encouragement from his brother Theo. However, they did not always get along. Despite being friends, in the end Van Gogh threatened Gauguin with a knife, forcing him to leave immediately. After Gauguin left, Van Gogh infamously cut off a piece of his ear. In 1889, sad and alone in Aires, the artist began to slip into mental decline and deteriorate rapidly. Eventually moving to the St. Paul Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in 1889, Van Gogh still continued to paint. His work evolved, delving deeper into the swirling application of paint that he began to explore in his 1890 piece, Wheatfield with a Reaper, a painting indicative of the unrest and instability of the artist. In 1890, Van Gogh left the asylum under the supervision of Dr. Paul Gaucher, despite not being well. The beginning of the same year, the artist's brother sent word regarding a sale of one of his works, and a magazine article that was going to print. However, still unable to cope with the depression and mental illness that plagued him, Van Gogh committed suicide on July 27, 1890, shooting himself in a wheat field. It wasn't until the early 20th century that artists such as Georges Seurat, Paul Cézanne, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Gauguin established themselves as post-impressionist contemporaries. In 1910, British critic Roger Fry coined the term post-impressionism in one of his essays. He argued that it was impossible to define the disparate work of artists such as Cézanne, Van Gogh, or Gauguin by any single term. Today the term post-impressionism is used in two ways. For some art historians, it broadly describes all artwork created in France during the last 15 years of the 19th century, including the late work of the Impressionists and the Symbolists. For the remainder, however, it is reserved for a more concise group of artists, including Seurat, Cézanne, and Van Gogh, artists who remained faithful to the idea of working from nature.